Welcome, Xiaodon. Xiaodon is part of the Financialization and Militarization Working Group that is part of the Security in Context project. And he's here today to talk to us about the research that he's going to be undertaking as part of that research theme. Thank you so much, Xiaodon, for being with us. Can you tell me a little bit about your background?
It's my pleasure to be here. So I'm a PhD student at Tufts University at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Previous to that, I worked in the at a place called the Arms Control Association a long time ago, but more recently at another think tank in DC called the National Bureau of Asian Research. Also have been working recently on a project with the World Peace Foundation on corruption in the arms industry. I've basically wrapped up on that. My current research that I'm doing for my PhD is on arms production and civil military relations in developing countries. So that's kind of what I've been working on recently.
Great. That all sounds really wonderful. And of course, I'm very familiar with your work and invited you to be part of the working group. So I'm very excited that you said yes. What is the particular topic or research question that you're going to be looking at as part of this project?
Yeah, so I'm looking at how important defense exports are for the sustainability of US defense contractors. And basically, how are foreign exports accounted for in the early decision-making stages of weapons development? So how do businesses think about foreign military sales? And how do they take those into consideration? So for example, if you look at a company like Lockheed Martin, about 25% of its sales in 2020 were outside of the US, non-US customers. And that's about double its profit for the year. So some companies export a lot more. For example, Raytheon, because they have customers for missiles and other components all around the world, they about 40% of their sales are external. Um, but other companies have much less sales, right? Other companies are very directed towards the U.S. Department of Defense. So Northrop Grumman, for example, only about 14% of its sales are outside of the U.S. So how do companies think about those sales, and at the early stages when they're planning which programs to bid for, and how does that determine the relationship with the DoD?
If I could ask you sort of a follow-up question, what do you predict
Yeah,
the answer to your question is going to be?
I predict that it's going to differ depending on the type of project, and that's part of what I want to delineate. So I don't want to jump ahead to some assumptions.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
I mean, I
actually,
think, yeah. So for some projects where when you're developing very cutting edge technologies and very highly specialized weapons platforms for the US military, you would expect that foreign military sales play a relatively small role in what business executives think about the financial calculations in their programs, right? Whereas items that are more components that go into dual use systems, for example, if you're developing a jet engine that might be appropriate both for small business planes and for jet fighters, then you would obviously care a lot about that. So part of the project, of course, is to delineate which types of programs that you would care more about.
thank you. A sort of follow-up question to that is about initiating exports early on, or companies focusing on exports early on in weapons development in order to lower the per unit cost of that weapon system to the U.S. military, because we know that upfront exports actually allow the company to build out some of the infrastructure so they can produce more of that weapon system at a lower cost, and that the U.S. government can come in later and procure it at a lower per unit cost. Do you think that's something that's going to factor into your research?
Yes, for sure. For sure. Part of the logic behind those programs is exactly what you described. However, there are many hazards in co-development, co-production that can cause these plans to not work out. Um, it is part of the story, but I think it is more marginal than we think. So there are large headline stories like the Joint Strike Fighter, where it's obviously the story, right? But for many programs, if you go back to the 1990s and you ask, if you look at the perspective of what Lockheed Martin or Boeing or Northrop is, when the US Air Force comes and says, we'd like you to build something like the F-22, right? This is a highly complicated, highly cutting edge program. What do the executives think are the possibilities for foreign military sales of something like that in the future? Or highly specialized naval vessels. Um, the US does not export its submarines, right? For example. For many programs, these aren't relevant considerations. And so the question I want to get at is whether the US defense industry is sustainable over the long term without those foreign sales.
Excellent. Really, really very thought provoking. What made you want to examine this issue in particular? Was it reading a certain article? Was it seeing, a news report on something in particular that really made you want to look at this sort of very specific slice of the issue?
Yeah, so there's both the subject and there's the timing. I think the timing is right because there's a massive shift in U.S. grand strategy underway, and there's a lot of pessimism about how the defense industry has performed. And I think there's a lot of turmoil within, well, foment within the literature right now about whether the defense industry is producing what people want for this great competition against China. So that's the timing. Specifically on this issue, I think um, I've always been attracted to to assumptions that look at the defense industry from a purely economic perspective and from a managerial perspective, and kind of merging that with the political uncertainty and the fact that we're addressing a lot of these approaches with uh, incomplete information and the vagaries of foreign policy. And how does the system of production tie into the foreign policy of a country and back and forth? That relationship back and forth has always been something I've looked at in my own research in comparative politics. And I think applying that lens to the US is something that I've always wanted to do. So the assumption that, for example, unit costs will go down because you'll have sales, foreign sales in the future, doesn't necessarily click if you don't have full information about what foreign sales in the future will look like. And so addressing those assumptions is I've always had questions about those assumptions as I read the literature. I want to poke at it a little bit and see what I can get out of it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
That really sort of brings around this point that often, as researchers, we treat the defense industry as something that is different and apart from other industries. Um, so I think you feel this way as well, that it's really important that we treat these firms just like other firms, right? Asking questions about how profits impact product development, how do supply chain decisions get made, to sort of demystify the defense industry, and treat it like an industry that is operating under the forces of global capitalism, and trying to point out how these decisions are made in much the same way that they're made in other industries. Why do you think that so much previous research sort of treated defense firms and the defense industry as impervious to these global economic forces that have transformed under other industries?
Um, it's a good question. I think there has been some writing on how globalization has affected defense firms. This was really in the late 2000s, early 2010s. I'm thinking of work by, for example, Richard Bitzinger, Mark DeVore, John Caverly, who's on my committee. And I think your work is very much in in this vein as well. Uh, so it's not that there's a complete lack of it. I do think that part of it is that we tend to see the structure of the defense industry as epiphenomenal to the military complex with the state in control. Of course, that's never how the U.S. System has ever worked, right? Our particular defense industry is a merger of U.S. capitalism in its mid-century form, with the defense industry having new needs at that time. And I don't think you can take either side as being the dominant force, and you have to look at both protagonists together, and not just the Defense Department and defense industry, but also the role of Congress and the role of the public. And so I think examining each one of these is each one deserves its own examination, and we can't just nominate one as the leading power in that relationship. Yeah.
Part of the reason probably why we researchers have treated the industry differently is that it engage right, its product is the means of conducting war, right?
Mhm.
And so um, a lot of the discussion that goes on, if we're looking at the commentaries of defense executives and managers and auditors and right financial planners, could be construed as impolitic, right? So
Mhm.
the discussion of profits in relation to developing, weapons of war. How do you think such conversations are phrased differently or framed differently from discussions in other industries that might give you some insight into your question?
From other industries.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
do they really
So
talk about, do they
yeah,
talk about mergers and acquisitions in the same way? Do they talk about,
yeah.
we're really looking forward to a bumper year, for exports of Hellfire
Yeah.
missiles? I mean, this sort of language.
I mean, to a certain extent, they do. If you look at the structure of financial reports for the defense industry, they look in the structure and what they discuss and the topics that they cover are exactly the same as any other industry. A lot of the investment materials look very, very similar. Um, when they talk about mergers, they talk about synergies and exactly the same reductions that all other mergers are inspired by, right? Um, they talk about market conditions. They talk about the effect of COVID, the same as any other industry. Um, I think the relevant part for my research, this research project in particular, is the uncertainties about the political climate, right? That is really huge for this industry. And so understanding, I think, how do you manage an industry where there's so much uncertainty about your market environment in the future and what steps they take to minimize those risks are going to be different. That's going to be the major difference. And that is it. That is precisely what actually I'm trying to look at here.
Excellent. And to effectively give us some insight into the way that these companies are operated, so that we understand them better, and can sort of confront the military industrial complex,
Yeah.
understand it better, and sort of confront it. So thank you so much, Xiaodon. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it and look forward to working with you on the project.
Yeah, look forward to it too.
Okay, great. Thank you.